when I finished writing the first paper on the thesis work, I felt that it had addressed a number of anthropological issues that I want to mention. One was that in the Man the Hunter conference in the mid-1960s, which changed our view of human history, really, that hunting had been a much more secure mode of provisioning and subsistence throughout most of human history, the argument went. But it explained hunters as having to adapt themselves to the environment, of not having too many children, of being mobile and constantly moving to find fresh game. It didn't actually suggest that hunters, or acknowledge that hunters were changing the environment, or in any way affecting its conservation. And I thought the thesis was important in that sense because it showed through the planning, the rotation, things like this, that hunters were intervening in the environment and shaping the environment just the way as you would normally assume agriculturalists were shaping their environment. An argument also developed out of the original writing from this work about whether the decline in harvests that I was reporting from the Cree reports to me on lands that were used more intensively was a function of Cree choosing and deciding to hunt less, or was it a function that there just weren't more game to catch? I can give you the somewhat provocative words that were used because it ended up in an interesting word exchange. This was a commentary, a questioning. It's difficult to see how a strategy of long-term resource management could repay the costs to individual foragers of foregoing immediate returns for uncertain future returns, given the uncertainties in the environment. When I responded in 1985, when my paper was reprinted, I noted first that Cree were talking about the decisions they made. This was not my presupposition. But also that their records of practice confirmed it, and I showed several. The most, I think, surprising of which was that moose is a very productive animal to hunt. You get 4 times more moose meat per day of hunting than you do from beaver hunting. But moose are also vulnerable. Everyone knows it's possible to overhunt them. Cree were only putting 8% of their hunting time into hunting moose, even though 75% of the days were good days to hunt moose. So I thought the kind of quantitative information that Crees had shared with me also really made clear that they were doing what they were talking about. And I recast the original questioner's question in a kind of provocative reply. It's difficult to see how a strategy of foregoing uncertain but necessary future returns for certain immediate depletion of resources made any sense. And I think it helped this kind of work to have an impact, especially among anthropologists who were trying to apply biological analyses to human activities, not by rejecting that, but by suggesting a more complex form of application, one that recognized human agency was needed. In some way, I was now recounting the message that Salisbury had made about my MA thesis. I think I had learned it. My first opportunity to publicly present the results of the research I had done was when I was invited to contribute to a special issue of the new anthropology journal Recherche Amérindienne au Québec, which was putting together an issue on James Bay, the place and the people, in 1971. The project had been announced in April. I think they were assembling by the summer. It was, I hadn't finished writing my thesis, but it was an important opportunity. I think the decision of RAQ to do this is an extraordinary bit of our history. The editors of a young Quebec French language journal decided to publish on short notice an intervention into the major public event of the time in Quebec. And they took on publishing diverse types of pieces, opinion pieces, personal stories, reflections, political arguments, and statements about what was needed by researchers and what was needed for government to do, plus some classical ethnography. It's not something that it's easy to think of many examples of even this many decades after. It was courageous, and they allowed people to mix these perspectives in the same article, so that I wrote a generally academic article, but put an opening and concluding statements on it that were intended to be arguments in favor of Cree involvement in decisions. And then I wrote a supplementary commentary in which I established that as really a personal statement. So I really appreciated that moment and its involvement. The time was quickly developing, and they were mobilizing a number of movements, both standard environmental movements and new movements coming up, opposing the hydro project and engaging them. The very important journalist who contributed a lot to that time, Boyce Richardson, wrote a quick book for the Sierra Club. Many Quebec-based organizations published pamphlets, and in fact my article from Recherche Emmer in the end was reprinted in one of those and was served as the basis for several of them, their own statements, along with, of course, all the things Cree leaders were saying. I mean, this was not to the exception, but to the addition. The challenge of writing about the political side, not just reporting the results of the research, was how to frame it. I had come to understand that Cree hunting stewards, individually and collectively, saw their relationships to governments and developers as ones of equality. They were sharing the land and ready to share it, but they expected an equal say in what was done on their lands. They made several points to me repeatedly in the time I was there with other projects. They complained that they weren't being informed. They expected to know what was to be done on their lands in advance. They expected this of non-Crees. And they said this to people. They complained that there were no discussions. They didn't mean consultations. They meant meetings of substance where decisions would be taken. It was clear. And they meant this for forestry operations, for mines, and for hydroelectric projects. And as I listened, I realized that they assumed that there would have to be, as I listened to them, I realized that there would have to be agreement before action could be taken. That they recognized the needs of others, they were willing to share, they weren't asking for a veto, but they were saying these discussions had to come to a mutual agreement. And the implication was nothing was to happen until that arrived. So they were really asking not for a kind of full governance, equivalent to that of a nation state, although maybe a little different because it was based on recognition of sharing, recognition of discussions, and an expectation of mutual agreements, which is not all inherent in nation-state decision-making. The challenge I and the Cree leaders at the time themselves were struggling with was how to express that. How to express the idea that they're a family and community governance, not just nation-state governance. How to express it to a public that was against the project and was supporting the Cree. How to express it as a statement of what should be, what should start to happen. Cree, of course, did a lot of that work. They pointed to it all the time, both the hunters and the leaders. They talked about having survived on the land, about having inherited the land, of having gained their livings from the land, of intending to pass their land on, of being there whereas others were intruders, and of being part of the land, which was a way of making that point. They spoke of being the primary caregivers. That was the message that came through in everything, and the primary decision makers. The problem I had was, what words do you use to describe that without leaving the field of political discussion? It was good in ethnography, but how to deal in the context of the political debates. And in a funny way, the government gave the answer. Governments would never have understood what hunting families considered. But at the time, I started, and Cree leaders actually first started to use the word management for what was being said. Management was a challenging word, because it could mean subsidiarity. It could mean decisions under the authority of a superior government or authority. But management was interesting too, because management can go on many scales. You can manage a family, you can manage family lands, and you can manage a hydro project. So management had a way that it could hint at some of the things that might be intended. But the government, in the end, resolved it. In talking about the region, the government created a corporation for development. And in July 1971, it gave administrative and effective government control over the whole region to a governmental corporation, the James Bay Development Corporation. And it said it would be an agency of conception, organization, direction, and control. In other words, a management agency. And so the word management became usable in that political context to mean not just consultations, not just conversations, but conception, direction, and control. In other words, full governance. Today we would call that a governmental system. But then it served as an analog, a space between government thinking and Cree thinking, in which the claims could be made. And so in my Recherche Amerindian article, I concluded that Quebec plans to manage and use the natural resources of the region, quote, would necessitate recognition that rational management of the animal resources of the region is already practiced by Waswanipi and Cree people, and their agreement should be obtained before resources which they are now managing and utilizing could be effective. So it was interesting, the transition from doing an ethnography or an anthropological study to entering the political arena required a whole series of conceptual transitions. Of course, course, the Cree leaders were by then very active in the public arena and were taking the leads. But there were these repeated calls for some studies. And interestingly, in discussions, both myself and Richard Salisbury with Cree leaders, they said, we don't have time to do studies. If, we won't do them, but if you have them, they kind of acknowledge that it would be useful to use them. And so the Recherche Amerindienne article came out, Natural History in New York, which was the journal of the New York Natural Museum, the Museum of Natural History, came out. It's a very glossy journal, widely distributed to the knowledgeable public in the US and internationally. I wrote an article for them based on the Waswanipi work. The Canadian Dimension, a Canadian journal, a broad journal of the left, invited an article where I focused on the history of Indian-white relations in the region, complementing the other arguments. And so the work that I had done with the Cree found various expressions in that early period during the mobilization of the Cree and of environmentalists against the hydro project, something we had not foreseen, but I was very thankful for. Taking the Cree, starting in 1972, in the spring and then more actively in the fall, took a court case against the development and the development activities. And I was asked to testify and help develop the court case. There were 46 to 40, around 46 Cree and Inuit witnesses in the case who really carried the case. There were supplementary work was done by a number of anthropologists, Adrian Tanner, Edward Rogers, Iggy LaRusic, Paul Bertrand, and myself. And in total, there were 160 witnesses called by both sides. The Cree hunters and Cree and Inuit hunters' testimonies showed they were stewards. They spoke with authority of living on the land and about surviving. They established they were experts, and they won the injunction, convincing the judge they had a way of life, they wanted it to continue, and it was at risk. I testified twice in that process. The first time I used the results of the Waswanipi research, largely in quantitative forms. And I think my main job was the judge heard a sample of Cree hunters. And the implication of the lawyers for the corporations was that these were not typical hunters, that people were being selected and not giving a typical view of hunting because they were arguing Crees and Inuits were now pretty much like the rest of Quebecers. They bought most of their food. They went on the land casually. And the way of life was dead or dying. And so my evidence was mainly using the 100 cases I had seen, using the 30 hunting camps I had visited to show that I could talk about the numbers here. It's not that Crees couldn't, but Crees couldn't, as witnesses, testify the way an expert witness can on the basis of their observations. They could only talk about what they personally experienced. I could talk due to the curiosities of court structure about observations. And so that was the role of the first part. The second part, I was asked if I would testify in response to an anthropologist who had testified for the corporations and the government. His testimony was a sympathetic statement of caution to the Crees that I am convinced was sincere and know was sincerely felt. But I found it, and it was I found it problematic, and it was very problematic in the context. He said that the changes the Cree were experiencing in recent years was provoking a certain withering away of Cree culture, and that to create a need for renewal among the Cree themselves, one that will allow themselves to recreate their culture, it takes a shock which is immediate, which is violent, and which is total. In other words, it takes a hydro project. I won't recount the specific replies. They were the obvious. Change makes a difference essentially when people want it and when they're actively participating in changes. And I won't go into all the detail. But as I replied to it, I started to get very concerned about what statements like that could mean to a judge. The judge had been very respectful, but it tipped no hands what he had learned or what he was making from the court case. And so I went into a completely unplanned response to the testimony after addressing it directly. I struggled to find a way of talking about my worries that the court would consider and that would make it understand it had to think carefully about this, the judge. But I had to express my concern about the court and the judge without mentioning the court. And along the way, I took up the voice of social science, of expertise, and knowledge of the Cree future, which I normally would have found uncomfortable. But I want to quote a bit about it because it's a kind of how things emerge and flow. I just did a bit of editing. The Native people are now watching very carefully to see what the response of white people will be. The term white was common. They're watching very carefully to see to see if their interests will be protected and upheld. And the Cree people, insofar as I know them and the way they think, they observe people carefully, evaluate whether a man was common, has respect for them, and has concern for them, and whether an institution does. And I think they're watching very carefully now to see if their interests can be upheld and protected in the present situation. They see themselves as threatened, and they, I think, if they gain a sense that there's no institution that can protect their interests and uphold them, they're going to suffer. It will reduce the integrity and the self-confidence people have, and it will break the control they've managed over their lives for these hundreds of years. And I turned to the question of the value of culture, because the judge ultimately had to decide whether it was stopping the project was more costly for the corporation than for the Cree. In terms of quantification, I don't see a way to put values on these things that can be made numerical. There's something very precious and successful in a way of living up there, and it needs not to be destroyed by any of these means. And if it is, I, as an anthropologist, have no means to quantify it. It was passionate, if subdued. In the end, the judge didn't need a lecture. The Cree witnesses had communicated the essentials to him. His ruling said that the difference between the two anthropologists on this point was of no relevance, which was good because we basically wanted it removed from the court process and court thinking. But I did think that, as the testimony suggested and the Cree themselves were saying, a very sensitive and critical time at a decisive period for Cree people had developed and been stimulated by the project. I didn't think of it in quite the dramatic terms of my testimony, but in the way Cree themselves were now mobilizing themselves and taking on this struggle in new ways. And so it was a very important period, and I was happy to be there for some of those moments.